February 12th, 1945, North Atlantic, somewhere between Halifax and New York. The freighter sliced through a low gray swell, her bow pushing aside water the color of lead. Ice flecked the railing, and the wind clawed at every exposed scrap of skin. On the main deck, beneath salt-stained tarpaulins and steel hatches, lay wooden crates stamped with a nondescript corporate seal, African Metals Corp. Nothing about them hinted at their true weight in history. Inside was concentrated uranium ore from the Belgian Congo, the densest stuff on Earth that mattered to the war. Bound first for Canadian refineries and then for the hidden factories feeding the Manhattan Project. To the crew, it was just another guarded cargo. To the men watching from the shadows on the other side of the ocean, it was the last thread in a plan that had already failed. The ship's captain, a reserve officer of the Royal Canadian Navy, kept one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee and the other on the rail of the bridge wing. Beside him, a United States Navy lieutenant from Naval Intelligence studied the convoy with binoculars, his collar turned up against the cold. A ring of escorts plowed through the gray water, destroyers and corvettes keeping a tight screen, their sonar sets probing the depths for any sign of a U-boat. "Last check with Halifax," the lieutenant asked. "Nothing on the wolf packs." The captain replied, "Not that I trust that, but they are running out of teeth." Somewhere beneath the waves, the hulls of dead U-boats lay mute in the cold dark. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany months earlier. Radar, long-range patrol aircraft, better convoy tactics, and broken German codes had carved holes in Admiral Dönitz's hunting packs. What few U-boats still stalked the Atlantic in early 1945 did so in an ocean where the hunters had become the hunted. Wikipedia. But this ship was not just another merchantman. Hidden in a coded manifest, under layers of misdirection and cover names, its cargo was flagged as Priority 1 for both governments in Ottawa and Washington. It would steam first toward Canada, where refineries at Port Hope would receive the ore, just as they had quietly done throughout the war, transforming rock from Great Bear Lake and the Congo into concentrated uranium compounds. From there, rail lines and special trains would thread the material south, toward Oak Ridge and other sites whose names the captain had never been told. He only knew that his orders were clear reach port. No matter what, far away in Berlin, in a cramped office within the battered shell of the Abwehr headquarters, a different officer stared at a wall of maps and strings that no longer made sense. Major Friedrich Albrecht, a thin man with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, leaned over a folder marked with a simple word, Uraneers, uranium ore. He had followed hints of this cargo for months through intercepted cables, shipping schedules, and scraps of information pried from agents in Lisbon and Stockholm. There had been rumors of a Congolese mine of unimaginable richness, of Union Miniere stockpiles that had vanished from Antwerp before German authorities could seize them, of mysterious American officers flying to Central Africa to speak with Belgian mining executives. But every time a lead had appeared, it had slipped away. A freighter noted in a Portuguese port simply stopped showing up in public registers. A supposed shipment through Lobito Harbor was quietly rerouted to Matadi at the last moment, then bundled into a convoy under an innocent name. Somewhere in the maze of Allied ciphers and dummy manifests, the true river of uranium had disappeared from his reach. That morning, a decoded report from a German agent in New York sat on his desk, stamped with the Red Eagle seal of the Reich. The agent, working under the cover of a shipping clerk, had finally confirmed what Albrecht had long suspected but never wanted to see in writing. Regular consignments of high-grade ore and concentrates, probably uranium, now arriving without interruption. Refining facilities in Canada and the United States appear fully supplied. Estimate that any attempt to deny these materials to the enemy has failed. Albrecht let the paper fall from his fingers. Outside, The faint thud of artillery echoed through a city that was slowly being encircled. Somewhere above Germany, American B-17s were already forming up for another daylight raid. The war was closing in. But in this small office, the defeat was of a different kind. It was not measured in ground lost or divisions destroyed, but in the silent failure of an entire intelligence effort. Out on the Atlantic, as the gray waves slapped against the freighter's hull and the escorts kept their lonely watch, the uranium that would feed the American reactors was already past the most dangerous stretch of ocean. In the next few days, it would slip into harbor under a winter sky, unremarked by the longshoremen on the docks, unknown to the civilians reading the morning papers. In Berlin, Major Albrecht lit another cigarette and opened a second file, this one thick with reports on the German nuclear program. As he scanned the numbers and notes, the realization settled in with a clarity that cut deeper than fear. The Americans would not run out of uranium. Whatever bomb they were racing to build, the raw material for it was already beyond his reach. February 15th, 1945. New York Harbor. Fog hung low over the Hudson, thick and yellowed by coal smoke, smearing the lights of the piers into hazy halos. A siren wailed somewhere upriver as tugboats chugged past, their decks slick with spray. Near Pier 92, where troop ships came and went like steel apartment blocks, a less impressive freighter edged into its berth, her hull streaked with rust and salt. On the dock, a man in a worn overcoat and a wool cap flicked ash into the dark water. To anyone watching, he looked like what his papers said he was: a clerk with a customs brokerage, pale from office air, used to long evenings waiting for ships that did not care about schedules. His name, for America, was Karl Brenner, for Berlin. The name that mattered was different, attached to an Abwehr file and a string of carefully coded reports. He watched as the cargo hatches were swung open. Cranes creaked to life, cables tightening, nets and pallets rising from the hold. Crates clattered, barrels groaned, forklifts lurched forward with an angry whine. Brenner pulled a small notebook from his pocket and pretended to check a manifest, eyes flicking between stencils on the crates and the line of trucks idling nearby. There it was again. African Metals Corp., a code he had been told to watch for, circled 3 times on the instruction sheet that had arrived from Europe by secret courier months ago. The first time he had seen it on a shipping docket, he had felt a thrill of success, the sensation of fingers closing around something vital. Now the sight only filled him with a slow, gnawing frustration. The crates did not go to any address he could tie to a named company. They went instead to a bland line on the form War Department, Final Destination Confidential. The trucks that carried them away were painted olive drab, without insignia, driven by soldiers who chatted about baseball and girls and how cold the winter had been, never about what they carried. Brenner had listened carefully, night after night, but heard nothing he could use. Across the street, in the shadow of a warehouse, another man watched Brenner. He wore a dark fedora pulled low, his gloved hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy overcoat. Inside his breast pocket lay a leather wallet embossed with 3 letters that did not appear on any public sign. FBI. Special Agent Frank Malone knew Brenner as a small fry, a suspected link in a German chain that had grown shorter every year. The Bureau had learned to spot the patterns by now: the carefully ordinary job, the cautious walks home, the small routine meetings in diners where nothing of consequence was ever said loud enough for a microphone. Malone lifted his gaze from Brenner to the ship and its cargo. He did not know exactly what African Metals Corp supplied, only that naval intelligence and a group of tight-lipped army officers seemed very interested whenever that name appeared in shipping logs. He knew the trucks went either north toward the Canadian border or west toward industrial towns whose maps were suddenly full of restricted zones. Brenner snapped his notebook shut. He had recorded the ship's name, the crate markings, The truck numbers. It would make a neat report for the next signal to Lisbon, another scrap for Major Albrecht's overflowing file. He told himself that it still mattered. That someone in Berlin was assembling a picture that only needed one last piece. But a quieter part of him, the part that had watched ship after ship arrive without incident, was beginning to understand. The Americans had built something his side could not pierce. Naval sensors, custom screens, multiple layers of handling, each step controlled by different officers that shared only what they had to. There were no single keys to steal, only a forest of small, well-guarded doors as Brenner turned to leave the pier. Malone stepped back into the shadow of a stacked pallet and let him pass. The Bureau did not need him yet. Better to keep watching. Let the line run. Somewhere above them. A foghorn groaned out on the river, deep and mournful. The ship's cranes swung again, lifting another pallet of African metals crates onto the waiting truck. No one on the dock cheered, no flags were raised. But with each crate that left the harbor, the uranium shortage that German scientists once counted on grew even more impossible. February 18th, 1945, Port Hope, Ontario. The wind coming off Lake Ontario carried a knife edge of cold that cut through wool and leather. At the gates of the refinery, the guard in the little wooden shack stamped his feet and watched his breath billow in pale white clouds. Beyond him, the low brick buildings and tall chimneys of the plant rose out of the snow, lit by hard electric light that made the night feel even colder. A train clanked through the yard, its boxcars groaning as they rolled to a stop. The paint on them was ordinary enough, a dull rail company logo, but the paperwork carried a different weight. Priority routing, restricted cargo, war ministry. The boxcar doors creaked open and forklifts moved in, their tires crunching over a thin crust of ice. Inside, the same unremarkable crates that had left New York Harbor sat in neat rows. African Metals Corp. The stencils were already familiar to the men here. They had been receiving them for years. Dr. Robert Kendall, his hair sticking up from under a knit cap, stood with his gloved hands shoved into the pockets of an oil-stained parka. He was no soldier, just a chemist from Toronto who had found himself drawn into a secret war of furnaces and beakers. His glasses fogged as he exhaled into the cold. Watching the first crate come off the train and onto a waiting flatbed, he knew exactly what sat inside dense, black-brown ore from a mine half a world away in the Congo. So rich in uranium that the samples had stunned geologists when they first tested them. To most eyes, it was just rock. To him, it was potential energy, locked away in the tight heart of atoms, waiting to be coaxed out by processes whose equations he sometimes traced in his notebook late at night, unable to sleep. A sergeant from the Canadian Army checked the manifest one last time and nodded to Kendall. "You have it, Doc." Kendall signed, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet as the truck rumbled toward the processing building. He walked alongside, boots crunching in the snow, inside those walls, behind doors marked with simple numbers and guarded by men who did not ask questions. The ore would be crushed, dissolved, precipitated, and refined. Yellow cakes of concentrated uranium oxide would come out of the other end of the process, dull to the eye but heavy in the hand, packed in drums that would then vanish onto another train. He had never been told where that train went. Not officially. But he had seen enough routing codes and heard enough slips in conversation to imagine the journey. South across the border, through quiet freight yards at night, to a valley in Tennessee whose name had been scrubbed from most public maps. Oak Ridge, a city that had grown out of mud and trees, ringed by tall fences and armed guards, humming at all hours with the sound of transformers and huge machines that separated isotopes so rare they could not be weighed in grains, only in thoughts of what they might do. If you stood there with him in the bitter air, you might not feel like you were witnessing a battle. There were no explosions, No banners, no roaring engines overhead, just the whine of the forklift, the rumble of the truck, the murmur of a foreman yelling for someone to fetch another pallet. Yet every crate that moved from train to plant pushed the war a fraction of a degree in one direction, across the ocean. In a German lab cramped between the walls of a university building that shivered with each distant blast of Allied bombs. Professor Klaus Hornig bent over a notebook of his own. His world smelled of chalk dust, tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of experimental apparatus. On his bench, a small lattice of cubes sat in a tank of heavy water, a fragment of the reactor design the German nuclear team hoped to perfect. He flipped through pages of calculations, frowning at the numbers that refused to bend. Their uranium was impure, their supplies limited. The cubes they could build were too few, the moderators too scarce. Their reactor assemblies stubbornly refused to sustain the elusive chain reaction they chased. Each experiment ended with the same cold verdict from the instruments: nothing. "We could do it, if only we had more," one of his colleagues muttered, tapping the drawing of a larger pile that they knew would likely never be built. More uranium, more heavy water, more time. Hornig looked up at the faint rattle of a window pane as another bomber formation passed overhead. Invisible in the clouds, somewhere out there, he suspected. His counterparts enjoyed no such shortages. They probably had entire warehouses of metal, rivers of ore, teams of engineers who never had to stop work because a shipment was delayed or a region overrun. He could not know how right he was, or that on the far side of the world, a Canadian chemist was watching trucks full of Congolese ore disappear into a plant that never slept. February 21st, 1945. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The night fog clung to the ridges like smoke from some unseen fire. In the fenced valley that locals had once known as quiet farmland, mercury vapor lamps burned with an almost unnatural harshness, turning the darkness into a harsh gray that never quite became a day. Trucks rumbled through the mud, their tires leaving ruts that froze on cold mornings and turned to deep trenches by afternoon. At the main checkpoint, military police in white helmets checked every vehicle with slow, methodical care. Mirrors flashed under chassis. Flashlights probed beneath tops. Papers were checked and rechecked. Beyond the barrier, signs warned in blunt black letters: restricted, no admittance. Talk means trouble. On this particular night, a small convoy crept up the slope, engines growling low. The lead truck halted under the glare of the floodlights, its cargo bed stacked with steel drums chained in place. The stenciling was simple, almost deliberately dull. Just numbers and letters, a routing code, and a weight that seemed suspiciously heavy for anything as simple as ore. Captain Sarah Donnelly of the Corps of Engineers stepped out of the guard shack, tucking a clipboard under her arm as the cold bit through her uniform. She had been at Oak Ridge for a year and a half now, long enough that the surreal sight of an entire secret city had started to feel like a strange kind of normal. She climbed onto the running board of the truck and rapped on the window. Manifest. The driver handed it over with a gloved hand. Donnelly checked the origin port. Hope. Ontario. Intermediate routing classified. Final destination inside the reservation. Chemical Processing Division 4. She glanced back at the drums. Inside each one lay processed uranium compounds, the fruit of mines at Great Bear Lake in the distant Congo, crushed and refined until they were no longer just rock, but feedstock for a project known only by a pair of words that no one spoke outside secure offices: Manhattan Engineer District. Behind her, a sentry watched with a Thompson cradled in his arms, steam from his breath drifting up past the barrel. "You get many of these loads?" "Mom," the driver asked, trying to sound casual. "Enough," she replied, signing her name in the allocated box. "And you did not see any of them?" He gave a strained chuckle and put the truck back in gear when she waved him through. Inside the reservation, The convoy threaded its way past rows of identical wooden dormitories, cafeterias, and Quonset huts. Light spilled from the windows, silhouettes moving past drawn shades. Thousands of workers lived here, many of them having no idea what they were helping to build. They knew only their small slice of the process, a pump to monitor, a valve to watch, a ledger to balance. The drums went to a low, sprawling building where the air already smelled faintly of solvents and hot metal. Forklifts carried them through an inner gate. Behind thick walls, men and women in lab coats and coveralls would open them and begin the next stage. Solutions would be mixed, filtered, dried. The bland yellow powder would become salt, then metal, then feed for tall, humming cascades of silver and steel, where isotopes would be teased apart by fields and forces most of the operators could not name. In an office overlooking one of the rail sidings, a colonel from the Manhattan district leaned over a map that showed lines stretching back to Canada and beyond. Each arrow represented a supply route, or from Africa and Canada, chemicals from Midwestern plants, metals from smelters guarded by men with rifles. Red circles marked threats the Army and Navy believed had once existed, U-boat patrol zones, suspected German informants in neutral ports, sabotage attempts that had failed before they reached a grand jury. An officer from Army intelligence stood beside him, arms folded. Our friends in the Bureau still have that man in New York on the hook, the intelligence officer said. The one hanging around the docks and brokerage offices. They think he is reporting on African metals shipments. The colonel snorted softly. Let him. By the time anything he sends reaches Berlin, these drums are already in the cascade or heading to the reactors. They cannot touch the flow now, not in any meaningful way. He traced one finger along the thick pencil line from the Congo mine to Matadi, from there to Atlantic ports, then to Canadian refineries and down into this hidden valley. Their scientists can wish for all the uranium they like, he said quietly. But wishing does not turn back convoys or pull these trains off the tracks. Outside, as another truckload of drums disappeared into the plant, the reality of that statement vibrated through concrete and steel. The supply lines were not perfect, not invulnerable, but they were enough. Enough to keep the furnaces burning, the separators humming, the project moving toward a conclusion that only a handful of people could fully imagine. Far away in Berlin, in a room dim with blackout curtains and stale smoke, Major Friedrich Albrecht stared at a map not unlike the one on the colonel's wall. The difference lay in the pins. His lines ended in question marks, broken arrows, and reports stamped with a single, damning word unconfirmed. He pressed his fingers into his temples, understanding in his bones what the colonel in Tennessee was now calmly stating over coffee. German eyes could still glimpse the surface of the American uranium river, but their hands would never reach its depths. February 24th, 1945, Berlin. The corridors of the ministry building smelled of damp wool, stale smoke, and dust shaken loose by distant artillery. The blackout curtains leaked a dull orange flicker every time another shell or bomb burst somewhere in the distance. The city was shrinking inward. But inside the stone walls, the paperwork had not stopped. It never stopped. Major Friedrich Albrecht waited outside the conference room with a folder under his arm, the edges of the cardboard gone soft from handling. The cover bore a single word stamped in red, large enough that even a passing clerk could not miss it. Uranium. A junior officer stepped past him, eyes hollow behind his round spectacles. They are ready for you. Major, inside. The room felt smaller than he remembered. The long table was scarred. One corner darkened where a candle had guttered and spilled wax. At the far end sat a general from Army Ordnance, his gray hair cropped short, his chest still bright with ribbons that meant less with every kilometer the enemy advanced. Two men in civilian suits sat to his left, both with the cautious posture of people used to speaking carefully in every direction. "Major Albrecht," the general said, "you have an assessment." Albrecht set the folder on the table and opened it. His fingers brushed over the stack of decoded signals, shipping reports, and agent summaries. For weeks he had tried to find another way to arrange them, another interpretation that did not lead where the numbers insisted on going. Tonight he had run out of evasions. Our sources in New York confirmed that shipments of processed uranium ores are arriving regularly in North American ports. He began. His voice sounded strangely distant to his own ears. "Crates marked under an African mining concern are moving without significant interruption. They are routed to Canadian refineries, then onward to American facilities we believe to be connected to their atomic program." One of the civilians, a physicist from the German nuclear project whose name was known but rarely spoken loudly, adjusted his glasses. "Volumes?" he asked softly. "Do you have any sense of the amounts involved?" "Major," Albrecht slid a chart across the table. "In another time. Another war." The rising line might have looked comforting. Here it was an accusation, based on frequency and capacity of the ships observed, and on refinery output estimates from Canada. "We believe the Americans have secured enough ore to sustain large-scale reactor operations and enrichment work for the foreseeable future." "The foreseeable future?" the general repeated, tasting the phrase. "In other words, we have failed to interdict their supply." "Yes, Herr General," the physicist cleared his throat. "Our own stocks," he said, "even if fully refined, are modest. We have no access to anything like the Congolese deposit. Our experiments are limited not only by plant capacity, but by raw material. Theoretically, with sufficient uranium and time, we could progress. Without those, we are performing little more than demonstrations for textbooks that may never be printed." The words hung in the air. Outside, another burst of distant artillery rattled the window glass. One of the civilian officials leaned forward. "You are telling us," he said to the physicist, "that even if we solved every technical problem, we could not hope to match the scale of American production." "I am telling you," the physicist replied, "that the enemy has a river, while we have a well that is already half empty." The general looked back at Albrecht. "What of sabotage? We have agents on the Atlantic coast, in neutral ports, in South America. Surely there is still something to be done." Albrecht had asked himself the same question every night for months. "Our maritime assets are diminished," he said carefully. "The U-boat arm no longer controls the North Atlantic. Convoys sail under constant air cover. Our agents can still observe, but the time between their reports and any possible action is too great. The Americans have layered controls around this cargo. Multiple services guard each stage of transport. We have found no single point of failure to exploit." The general closed the folder with a slow, deliberate motion. "So," he said, "on this front, the war is decided." No one answered. In that silence, Albrecht felt a peculiar calm settle over him. The terror that had once lurked underneath his work, the fear that the Americans might secure the very thing his own scientists craved, had transformed into a grim certainty. The material was already flowing into their furnaces and reactors, beyond reach of any plan he could imagine in the dwindling time left. Later, as he walked back through the darkened streets, past craters full of black water and walls pocked by shrapnel, he thought of the man in New York they still watched through half-broken networks of radio and couriers. That agent would keep counting crates, tracking ships, sending reports across an ocean filled with enemy ships. For what purpose? On the far side of the world, those same crates were already vanishing into guarded fences and secret valleys. The war in steel and fire still raged, but the hidden conflict over uranium supply had ended without a single shot that the public would ever know by name. February 28th, 1945. Washington, District of Columbia. The Potomac lay under a thin skin of gray light. its surface chopped by a cold wind that rattled the bare branches along its banks. Inside a tall War Department building, far from the sound of artillery and craters filling with black water in Berlin, another kind of battle report was being read aloud. In a secure conference room with a single narrow window painted over from the inside, 4 men and 1 woman sat around a polished table. Maps and charts were pinned to the walls, but the centerpiece was a single sheet of paper resting before a brigadier general with deep lines at the corners of his eyes. The paper was thin, almost fragile, but its words carried more weight than many field reports from the front. At the top, in precise type, it read, "Status Report. Strategic Materials. Uranium." The general cleared his throat. "Our latest assessment from Canadian and domestic facilities," he said, glancing at the people around him, "confirms what we have been hoping to hear. Shipments from Belgian Congo reserves and Canadian deposits have reached all scheduled processing plants with no significant losses. Present stocks and projected deliveries are sufficient to sustain current and planned operations for the Manhattan Engineer District." The room was silent for a heartbeat. Then Captain Sarah Donnelly exhaled slowly, hands folded around a pencil she had unconsciously been gripping too tightly. In her mind, the statement did not look like typed words. It looked like trucks grinding through Tennessee mud, like drums in the back of rail cars rolling past barbed wire, like clipboards stamped at Port Hope in freezing air. A man from the Office of Naval Intelligence tapped a finger on the table. "What of German interference?" he asked. "We know they have tried to follow the Congo ore. Any indication they have managed to disrupt deliveries?" Across from him, an FBI liaison flipped through his own file. "Enemy agents have identified certain commercial fronts and shipping routes," he admitted. "We have run surveillance on a suspected Abwehr asset in New York for months. He has eyes on certain piers, certain crate markings, but he has no hand on the flow itself. Every time he sends a report, the material he is describing is already beyond his reach, wrapped in War Department chains or inside reservation fences." He hesitated, then added, "The Germans know the river exists. They just cannot touch the water." The general nodded once. "Then we proceed. No changes to priority. Security remains tight on all legs of the route. Personnel rotations continue as planned. The scientists will have what they require." No one in that room spoke the word bomb. They did not need to. It hovered in the air, unprinted, heavy as lead. Later that night, long after the meeting ended, Donnelly stood alone on a parapet overlooking part of the rail yard at Oak Ridge. The valley was alive with light, an industrial glow that turned the low clouds orange and made the surrounding hills look like dark waves frozen in mid-surge. Locomotives hissed and clanked, moving strings of cars whose contents were known in detail to only a handful of people. She watched as another set of drums, painted a dull, ordinary color, rolled slowly toward one of the processing buildings. From here they looked insignificant, just more metal among thousands of tons of steel and concrete. But she knew what their paperwork said. Uranium compounds, refined from ore that had been under African soil for ages beyond counting, somewhere across the ocean, in a city shaking itself apart under falling shells. A German major walked through streets full of rubble with a folder pressed to his chest. His reports told him that the same ore now moving past Donnelly had slipped through every net Germany had thrown across sea lanes and piers and neutral embassies. His war in the shadows had ended with no triumph, only the quiet knowledge that he had watched an opportunity drift away, grain by grain. Here, in this guarded valley, the outcome of that hidden contest was written not in speeches but in schedules and fuel orders. Reactors would receive their fuel on time. Enrichment plants would not fall silent for lack of feed. There would be no emergency cables begging Canada for one last shipment. No desperate searches for alternative mines. The river of uranium was secure. The river would keep flowing. Donnelly drew in the cold night air and let it out slowly, watching it vanish in the light that never quite faded over Oak Ridge. In months or years to come, perhaps historians would argue about strategy and battles, about generals and offensives. Few would trace their fingers along the lines that ran from a Congolese mine, through Canadian refineries, along guarded railroads and secret junctions, into the heart of this valley. But in that narrow strip of time, in February 1945, the truth sat quietly in locked filing cabinets in Washington and in a weary major's mind in Berlin. The American effort to secure uranium had succeeded completely. German spies had seen enough to recognize their failure, yet never enough to change it. Far below, a whistle blew, and another train moved off into the bright dark, carrying barrels whose contents would soon disappear into reactors and machines that hummed like distant thunder. The war of ore and atoms, supply and sabotage, had already chosen its side.